Speed on D.
All right, this is Mike Cronin, September 25th, take one.
Great. And Mike, so I can set my audio levels, if you wouldn't mind reading that at home, I would appreciate it.
It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul.
Wonderful. Can I have you read it one more time?
It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul.
Great, perfect.
Sir, I'm going to put that on the floor.
Okay.
And we'll see it. Thank you. Thanks.
He's got a great voice. Yeah. All right. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for joining us and being willing to share your stories and your thoughts with us. This project is entitled Return with Honor for good reason. It's, I know that many of you, former POWs, have been interviewed many times and featured in many things. What makes this project different is that the audience for this is the military. It is in the testing the Navy did on former POWs, the metrics they found were outstanding. That the incidence of PTSD among you and your fellow officers and others who were there is under 4%, whereas in the control group it's near 40%. That you are healthier, more well-adjusted, more able to move on with your lives than those in the control group. And they've been confounded by those metrics, honestly. But as I've met many of you and talk with you, it is not a surprise to me as I begin to experience the grit, resolution, the dedication, the commitment, and the sense of personal honor that you all carry. Leadership, former future officers can learn from your stories. The adversity you went through. Frankly, for me, a lot of the public's consumption of your story has a kind of voyeuristic attitude or approach. They want to know about the torture, and the torture is a huge part of the story. I would call it inhumane, but it was done by humans to other humans, and so it is beyond inhumane. And where that's an important part of your story, the true heroics of your story are not because you suffered. They're the way you met your suffering and the way you banded together, found ways to communicate, found ways to resist, and found ways to create a sense of self that was post this first sense of failure. So in today's environment of leadership, young people coming in are used to video gaming and things moving at a digital pace. And what the Stockdale Center finds is that we're, for instance, midshipmen at the Naval Academy might be getting the right answers on honor and ethics quizzes. Emotionally, they're not internalizing it. And the very nature of your story is emotional in basis. And the way that you had to dig inside each day and find new definitions of yourself is instruction for all of us, certainly for the military. So you're able here, if you wish, to speak in a way to a military audience. It's different than you might speak to the general consumption of the public. We're looking for those innuendos and those understandings, the deeper understands rooted in leadership and honorable choice. Okay.
Well, I have a personal theory about our group. In order to get to Hanoi, you had to pass through quite a few filters. In my age, when I went through flight training, you had to have a college degree. You had to have a commission, which is another filter because there's training and there are those who don't complete the training. Then, as you went through flight training, you had to be selected to go into carrier operations with combat aircraft rather than something else. Then you had to be assigned to a ship that was going to Yankee Station, and you had to not find a way to avoid that, and you had to just go through it. So by the time most guys got to Hanoi, they had been through all those filters, which means most likely they had a stable, well-integrated personality. All kinds of different personalities, some you might like, some you might dislike, but all of them were functional, stable personalities. In my case, having been through all those filters, in the case of the more senior guys who had flown in Korea or even World War II, then they also had a long history of being under stress.
Excellent, excellent, sir. And by the way, if at any point there's a question that you feel uncomfortable answering or anything, we just say, let's move on to another question, and I'll be happy to move on. When we get edit out anything, if you look back and you go, oh, you know what, can you strike that? Just easy to do.
Well, there's another issue also. I went through the Naval Academy and graduated in 1963, and you have to remember what was the atmosphere in the United States after the Korean War when the discussion was about prisoners of war. At that time, the United States simply didn't understand what the situation was like for those Korean prisoners of war, and there were a wide variety of prisoners in Korea. Some of them young teenagers with very little training who were not really prepared for combat, and others, Navy and Air Force pilots who had more training and more experience. There was a lot of public criticism of the behavior of prisoners of war in Korea after the war, and we all knew that, and as a result of that, President Eisenhower issued the Code of Conduct, and all of us were trained in the Code of Conduct, and all of us had been to survival, escape, resistance, and evasion training before going overseas. And the last thing any of us wanted was to be criticized, as were the Korean prisoners of war, so we were all determined to do the right thing to the extent we could.
Patrick, 1 second, sir.
Is that on, Ken?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
It'll take a few minutes to cycle.
Okay. We're just turning off the air conditioning.
Sure.
There's no,
Yeah, no problem.
So, you're good to go?
Yes, sir.
So you talk about the Code of Conduct, and this is a kind of turning point for every former POW in their story. I think in many ways, we as human beings need time and distance to assess our own experiences. And there's a way in which the Vietnam War, we're only now ready to look at it and to really take in the truth of all of it for ourselves. But going into the Vietnam War, coming from Korea and World War II, we went in with a kind of John Wayne attitude. Our films were full of that, unflawed characters, unflawed heroes who could endure any suffering, who could, master anything. And we went in with technical superiority, military superiority in Vietnam. And as Charlie Plum said to me, Patrick, you need to understand we were the first failed warriors of the first failed war to us. And that was psychologically very difficult on us. And then, when we got in there into torture, and if someone tortures you long enough, they're going to break you. That you find that out very quickly. So suddenly, and all the pilots that I've talked to who were at all were able to parachute and have any kind of float time on the way down, tell a similar story. On the carriers and briefings and everything else. The fighter pilots are an elite cadre, right? And suddenly you're floating down, and each of them would describe hearing this top, top, top sound, and realizing that the Vietnamese were down with small arms fire shooting up at them. And as Charlie said, there was this this moment of shock, like, don't you know who I am? I'm an American pilot, you're shooting at me. And then the rude reality of landing in a rice paddy, and suddenly you're in another much more primitive world, and a new kind of reality sets in. So when you found, the subject I'd like to look at here is failure and recovery from failure. Each former POW I've talked to went through a kind of personal crisis, feeling that revealing more than name, rank, and serial number amounted to a betrayal of country. Reed McCleary told me how he lay in his cell for a year and a half with 2 broken knees, weeping basically, saying if he ever got out of Vietnam, he would never be able to return to his country, he would never be able to face his countrymen. And story after story of people saying, you don't want to know me, I broke. And then that redemptive moment when one of the fellow POWs reaches out and says, there are no virgins here, we all broke. What we're finding is that there is an ingredient to the personal successes of the former POWs, and somehow it begins with that moment of failure, when you're having to find a new definition of yourself, something to fight for, something that is not an idea of yourself given to you by your society or your military training, anything else, but the whole hardcore truth of yourself. Can you speak to that, sir?
Yes. First of all, I didn't find it in any way surprising or different that the Vietnamese were shooting at me as I came down in my parachute. I'd flown 175 missions, and I was well aware that we were in a real war and people were shooting and getting killed. So that was not a surprise. And it took me 16 days from the day I was captured to reach Hanoi. On the way to Hanoi, I was not treated badly, but I knew very well things were going to be very bad when I got to Hanoi. And it was no surprise that they were going to use torture. It was, shall I say, it made you angry that they were lying and using torture and doing all those things that they weren't supposed to do. Now, all of us were indoctrinated with the code of conduct and tried to resist that: name, rank, serial number, date of birth, and all that stuff. Well, I object to your use of the term broke. All of us gave ground. I certainly did. I was not able to stick with name, rank, and serial number, but I was able, through deception and lying, to conceal any useful military information. In fact, I only had one serious military interrogation, and in my view, I got through it without giving away anything that was useful. The real struggle came with political interrogations, asking me for mission descriptions of every one of my missions and all that kind of stuff, and personal information which you didn't want to give. And of course, I felt badly and was embarrassed by the fact that I had to go beyond name, rank, and serial number, but that doesn't mean I was broken. I was still concealing what I thought was important information. One of the things, for example, that they were very interested in was the ECM equipment we had, which affected the guided missiles they were shooting at us. And I was very involved in that with the Shrike missile and the ECM that we had in the Navy airplanes. But I didn't tell them anything about that. I avoided that, so that was a success. Yes, I broke in that I had to talk, but I was able to conceal what I thought was important information. And I gave wrong information about my personal life, which may have had something to do with the fact that I didn't get any mail for several years. So yeah, and I felt bad and embarrassed, And just as you've described, communication with the other prisoners after you get through that first phase of the interrogation and torture was critically important, because now you're all together and you realize you all have had the same experience. You're not a personal failure, you're one of the crowd, and we can stick together and support each other and make resolutions about how we're going to handle future interrogations and all that stuff. So the support of the group was critically important, and your prior training and motivation to adhere to the code of conduct as best you could, that was important as well.
Great, beautiful. Just to clarify, it was not the use of that word break was quoting other people who have used that word. I wasn't actually thinking.
The reason I object to it is because that's the movie term. Oh, did he break under torture? Meaning, did he give all the information and expose his comrades and all that stuff? So, yeah, we all gave ground because that was the best we could do under the circumstances. Every human being has physical limitations, and one of the important things is the principle. There's no way you can establish how much a person has to endure before he gives ground. No two people are the same. There's no standard of capacity. And when guidance came from the senior officers, they never used that. What they said was, don't let them permanently injure you. Start out with no and do the best you can.
Beautiful, beautiful. So let's talk about leadership, because that's the senior leadership, how you experienced the role they played and how important it was to you and your fellow people. And as an adjunct to that leadership is also, from every story I've heard, there was stellar followership in the sense that the junior officers carrying through the apparatus of communication and everything else, it was exemplary all throughout. I mean, obviously there would be a few holdouts, but for the most part, it was pretty extraordinary.
Well, that's absolutely right. The leaders did their job and paid a heavy price for it. They were never recognized as leaders by the communists, and so the chain of command and the followership that all of us at the lower levels exercise, that was based on our secret communication system, the TAP code and other means, and that really carried the day. First of all, almost all of us believed what they were saying was the right thing to start with. And they had a bunch of simple rules that they passed down to the rest of us, which made perfect sense to 99% of us. It wasn't fun, it wasn't good, maybe it wasn't what you wanted to hear, but it made perfect sense, and for the most part, we all tried to do that. And the key thing was the communication. We all were ready to obey the senior ranking officers, and but you can't do that without communication. Communication was everything.
One of the examples of that line of communication was the acronym BAC-US. Were you familiar with that? Is that something?
It's been a long time, and I no longer recall what that means.
Okay. So, in brief, I believe it was something about don't bow to the enemy. And I actually can't recall. There's one, don't kiss the enemy goodbye. But I think the more salient and important one was the last, which was US, had a dual meaning. One was the United States, and the other one is unity over self.
Oh, yes, yes, absolutely critical. You have to stick together no matter what. That is everything.
And that was kind of one of the amazing things about all of you is that even in solitary, there were periods of time before the TAP code was really promulgated throughout the ranks and stuff like that, when there was fledgling communication, that, and I suspect, and I'm asking you whether the source of this is your military training, that each of you as Each of you had a resolution to resist to the extent that you were able and to find ways to resist. When you were able to unify through the communication, you were able to create ways to do that together. But each of you had to go into that interrogation room alone. So speak to me about that, please.
Well, I think I've already really covered that. We're all trained on the code of conduct and been through survival school and so forth. And especially in my own case, growing up in the 50s when there was a lot of negative talk about Korean prisoners of war, you knew very well you were going to be tested and it was going to be bad. And of course, as you have described, when you can't come through that test with a score of 100%, and I certainly didn't, I gave information I didn't want to give, but I think I was able to protect things that really mattered. So I failed by the absolute standard, and of course what you find out is that everybody else has had the same experience, and that comes from communication. And the communication, especially the TAP code, is a real story. None of us knew anything about the TAP code that wasn't part of our prior training. It actually got started with an Air Force guy who had seen something like it in a communist novel or story. I'm not sure if it's a true story or a novel, Darkness at Noon by Arthur Koestler. And he had read the book, and that's how, in a communist prison, the prisoners communicated by tapping on the walls just as we did. And so, for me, when I got to the interrogation rooms, which were dirty old cells with like a wooden table in it, and there was all kind of hand scratching on the table, and in several places I saw this grid with letters in it, which meant nothing to me at the time. Okay, roll ahead several weeks, and I'm in Heartbreak Hotel, which was a small cell block of solitary cells, and I didn't know any better. I knew there were prisoners in the other cells. The guy to the left of me was a Vietnamese, South Vietnamese officer who had been captured, been there for many years, and I banged on the wall. He did not respond because he could tell I didn't know what I was doing. It turns out that the cell next to me on the other side was just one that was used as a washroom. And guys would go in there and empty their buckets and wash their hands and whatever. And so I would also bang on that wall. And finally, Paul Galante, who was brought back there for some reason, I'm not sure what, responded. And this is one of the key things about communication. In order to inform a new prisoner how we communicate, somebody has to take a chance. In my case, it was Paul Galante, because he was in there with another fella whose name I've forgotten. I think it was Will Forby. But anyway, they cleared and waited until no guard was around, and then he told me verbally, okay, here's how we communicate. We have a 25-letter grid. There is no K. So every letter has a matrix address. Practice that, and that's how you communicate. And that was all. He got a chance to stay, and now the light came on because I could remember what I'd seen engraved in the interrogation table in the interrogation room. And so that's it. And so I practiced that and memorized it, and another couple of months later, when I was put in the main prison area out of the interrogation complex, I looked through a crack in the door, and I saw a guy coming across the courtyard, and I recognized him. It was Jim Mulligan. Jim Mulligan had been, when I went through A4 training, it was a bunch of Lieutenant JGs and ensigns like myself in Jacksonville, Florida, and we had one commander also going through A4 training. It was Jim Mulligan. Great guy. old Sea Dog, who gave us a lot of good advice. And I transferred out of the squadron, went to Vietnam, didn't see him again or hear about anything about him until I saw him walking across the courtyard, and they put him in a cell right next to me because he was going to be interrogated there. So as soon as he got in the cell, I started tapping, and that was my first contact was with Jim Mulligan.
Yeah, we're going to be speaking with Jim and interviewing him, and I think next week or the week after. And I read in one account, I think it was in Honor Bound, where Jim in particular, when he learned the tap code, went after it feverishly, memorized it. And it's sort of, maybe you can illuminate for the people think of just the simple matrix. Oh, okay, we could tap out a word. But one of the things that also made it difficult for the Vietnamese to understand what you were tapping, because they knew you were tapping, and they might even figured out the code. But you also had a shorthand within it. You would abbreviate. I mean, basically, long before the internet, you were using abbreviations that in the internet they use LOL and BFF and all these things. But you were doing that back then, because I read a sample tap, and I couldn't make heads or tails of it. And then when I read the translation, I realized that you were using as abbreviated context as you could. So maybe you can make that part of it clear.
Well, okay, anybody who has any experience with text messaging knows exactly what you're talking about. It's awkward to do text messaging and get out long words, so people use abbreviations. That's what we did. The tap code is a complex thing. Each letter can be as many as 4 or 5 dots, and so a word you may be pressed for time. So abbreviations are everything. Common one: how do you end a message? GBU, God bless you. So and there were many of those, and that became very important because you can't imagine that communication went on in secret without the Vietnamese knowing anything about it. They caught us dozens, maybe hundreds of times, and eventually they knew the tap code and tried to use it to entrap us. But number one, their English was poor, and number two, they didn't know any of the abbreviations, and so when they tried to use the tap code, it was pretty obvious and nobody responded.
That's wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, sir. That's perfect. What was the, hold on 1 second. Let me get my flashlight here a second. Yeah, that's a little loud. Okay, good. When was the first time you heard or heard tapped the phrase "return with honor"?
Well, that came along later when the first few early, there were some early releases. I think it started in 1968. And up until that time, that didn't seem to be a main focus. But when the Vietnamese were able to get a few people, and by the way, most of those people were ones that had never gotten in the communication net. And so they rationalized to themselves that it was okay to do what they did. Now, we don't think that's right, but that's kind of what happened. And when that happened, that was very disturbing to the leadership because they could see, correctly, I believe, that if this got out of hand, you could have some crazy situation where there was competition to see who could get released. And so after that, the emphasis was really on we're going to hang together and we're going to come home with honor.
And can you speak, because it seems that part of that emphasis on honor absolutely is predetermined by that together. That we are going to do this together. That there's strength in the resolve of numbers, and that as a goal was something every man was able to achieve. Can you speak to
Well, it's all about communication and group cohesion. That is the main thing that held that together. Sure, we're all patriots, and we all want to do the right thing. But in any situation where you're faced with the enemies, the main thing is group cohesion. That's what holds it together. And that's what the communication was all about.
Beautiful, sir. Beautiful. That is a gem of military insight. Eb Alvarez spoke to me and said the Vietnamese never really understood the American warrior. And it struck me that in the United States, if we captured an enemy, it would not even occur to us to need that enemy to sign or go on TV saying America's great. And, you know, it just wouldn't even occur to us. We are confident in our greatness. And so we don't, because we're not in a society that is indoctrinating us in order to press us to its will. And so there's this dramatic difference between a communist society in terms of their outlook. They need to win you over to their point of view. We don't really care if you share our point of view or not. We feel fine about our point of view. Can you speak to that?
Yes, well, there really are 2 points there. Sure, they would like to win you over and have you be a cooperating prisoner, but more important than that, they wanted propaganda. They wanted statements from prisoners opposing the war or criticizing the United States. And how do they get those statements? Through torture. So it wasn't really convincing, although there were a small handful of people that fell for that. Okay, so they knew they're fighting a public information war as well as a military war, and they wanted those statements. I can remember during the early part of the war, when I was not a prisoner and flying missions, that there were a number of statements that came from Hanoi that were printed in U.S. newspapers. And we all knew that nobody is going to write those statements willingly. There had to be torture and other mistreatment that went on to get those statements. But the newspapers were printing them as if they were true. And finally, after the war had been going on for about a year, and I was still flying combat missions and not a prisoner, the American Association of Newspaper Editors agreed among themselves that they would no longer print those kind of statements. So, at least initially, the communists won quite a victory because those statements were obtained by torture, were printed in the newspaper, and marketed as fact.
That's interesting. Please, if you could, sir, give the listener and the viewer some perspective. I'm sorry, I don't know the exact length of your internment, and was it 6 years?
6 years, yes.
6 years. In 6 years, the world is changing around you. As Charlie Plum said to me, apparently there was a lot of, Russian newspapers or something that would be available for you to read. They wanted you to read their propaganda. And Charlie took it on as an exercise. And one day he was reading something the Russians were boasting that they had sent an unmanned rocket into space or to the moon. And in the caption they said, unlike the Americans who needed a pilot to get there. And in that moment, he began to, wait a minute, did we go to the moon? And that was tapped through in the questions and people discussed it. But it kind of gives perspective. Styles changed, the world changed, this whole thing was going on. You didn't know who won those series or necessarily who was even president. Can you give me a little perspective on what was that was for you?
Well, 2 parts there. First of all, the moon landing. After, at some point, I can't remember the exact date, maybe it was part of 1968, about once every 3 months you get a package from home. And of course, the Vietnamese had opened it, gone through it, taken out a lot of the stuff, and you got some stuff. Well, somebody around the time of the first moon landing got a package, and one of the things that was left in the package, overlooked, whatever, I don't know, was a little packet of sugar like you'd find in a restaurant to put in your coffee. And on the back of that little package of sugar was a picture of an astronaut standing on the moon next to an American flag. And somehow the Vietnamese had missed it or whatever, I don't know, but there it was. And so the word was passed out that we had made it to the moon. And yeah, sure, there was lots of propaganda. And I listened to it very carefully because getting an idea of what's happening in the world was, in my view, an exercise in reading between the lines, not reading what it actually said. What it didn't say, it's like living in a medieval society where there are no real newspapers, there's only rumor and discussion and so forth. And so you kind of learn to interpret that and get some idea of what is happening in the world. When I got back to the United States in 1973, my impression is everybody's angry and upset, and you know what? Everything is better than it was when I left.
Well said, sir. Well said, sir. and let's speak to that for a moment, because one of the things we wanted to look at was gratitude. I've found that the Vietnamese sought a systematic effort to humiliate you. What I have found is that each of you that I've met has a quality of humility that has a strength in it. It's that, and, hold on, okay, go ahead. That each of you has this quality of humility that has this amazing kind of strength. And humiliation has this way of being, taking something away from you, but humility has something that you can't take away. It is something that intrinsic. Can you speak to that?
Well, I'm not sure exactly how to answer that. Sure, the Vietnamese looked down on us and tried to make that clear that they did. But nobody really believed that. I mean, you know that these guys are not your friends. Now, and there were exceptions. There were a few guards who tried to be friendly. They usually wouldn't last long because the Vietnamese had a very clear idea about how the prison was to be run. They did not want any of the guards who were not in a supervisory position to know any English. And they didn't want us to know any Vietnamese. So if it was seen or determined that a guard was trying to learn English or teach Vietnamese, they would disappear. So yes, they wanted to maintain that barrier that they could speak Vietnamese without us knowing what they're talking about. That was part of it. And the bowing, which is an Oriental courtesy, which we hated and refused to do in public. In fact, one of my experiences was to be be kept in a temporary prison with some other fellows near the Hanoi electrical power plant, because that was a main target. And I'm not sure, the Vietnamese never explained anything about it, but either they wanted us to be killed and they would have publicity that we'd killed our own prisoners, or perhaps that the United States would learn we were there and not bomb the target. In fact, the target was bombed repeatedly while I was there, and it was, if you will, an illustration of why our bombing tactics were ineffective. Summer of 1967, perfectly clear day. There's going to be a raid. It's going to be at noon, okay? Sky is blue. Hanoi is surrounded by anti-aircraft weapons of every conceivable type. Airplanes are going to come either from Yankee Station or over the ridges from Thailand. Okay? Start hearing anti-aircraft warnings and shooting about 5 or 10 minutes before the raid gets there. So there's no surprise. There's no possibility of surprise. Okay? And as airplanes approach, sirens go off, the anti-aircraft is shooting, bombs fall, and it's over. The actual raid lasted probably 30 seconds to a minute, and it's gone. One time, when I was in that prison, myself and Ralph Gaither, who was my cellmate, or lived in the adjacent cell, I was in solitary, our job was to go into the power plant and tap the boilers for drinking water, which would be distributed in the camp. So often, once a day, we'd get this big bucket on a pole, and we'd each be on each end of that pole, march into the power plant, tap the boilers, take it back to the camp. Okay, one time when that happened, an air raid came. Okay, once you get in the power plant, here's what you see. Number one, it had really high revetments around the outside so that only an exact direct hit is going to do any damage. Second thing, had a reinforced concrete roof with a few air holes in it. So either it has to be a bomb that goes through that hole, or it has to be something big enough to get through that reinforced concrete. Second thing, there were escape routes and shelters for the employees, and when the air raid siren went off, the Vietnamese employees working in the plant where we were tapping the boiler, they thought it was funny. They weren't scared. They thought it was funny, and they laughed and pointed at us, and then they all disappeared into their underground shelters. So the only person really suffering there is the guard, because until he gets us back in our cells, which might be a couple hundred yards away, he's got to guard us. So by this point, it's one of the low points of my captivity. I kind of had hangman's humor, and Ralph is in the front of this thing, and I'm in the back kind of tugging on it, walking as slowly as I can, because my pleasure for the day is to see this guard squirm because he wants to get in his shelter. So we eventually get back there and put this in our cells, and which are just converted rooms from some housing development or whatever, I don't know. But anyway, so then his job is to get in one of these. Around the city, they had these drain pipes, the big concrete jobs, and they were dug into a hole, so his shelter was to get into that thing. Now, I had a crack where I could watch his action, and he was pretty nervous, and my pleasure for the day was watching him squirm as the bombs fell.
That's great. You weren't concerned about your own safety. You were just enjoying the fact that he was anxious about his. I like it. You're a very brave man. So.
Well, it wasn't that I was so brave. It was just my mental state at the time. There had been enough raids, and I had, you can only get so scared in a few seconds, and there had been enough raids that, sure, there was some risk, but that period of time, about 4 months when I was in that situation, was one of the more interesting experiences I had, because we're out in the city and you can see some civilian activity and so forth, and you could also see what the Vietnamese were doing as defense. They put up smoke screens around the plant. It was interesting to watch. It was much better than sitting in your solitary cell back at the Hanoi Hilton.
If you would, just so that I have these cutaways of your experience, could you sketch a brief chronology from the time you arrived in the Hanoi prison system? I know you spent time in the zoo. I think you initially started out at Heartbreak Hotel, is that correct?
Yes. It took me 16 days to get from where I was captured to Hanoi. That's an interesting experience in itself. Okay.
Please take some moments to describe that place if you wish.
Well, the route of travel was Route 1. Started out walking during the middle of the day, and airplanes, this is the same day. I was shot down early in the morning, so this is the same day that I was shot down, and now we're on foot. We're walking north, and one of the things I was able to observe was that there were slit trenches along the beach. So the Vietnamese had, and this is near Thanh Hoa, between Vinh and Thanh Hoa, and so the Vietnamese had anticipated that there might be an invasion because they had dug trenches along the beach. And there were airplanes overhead, apparently still looking for me because it's the same day, only a few hours later. And the two guards that were marching me north made it absolutely clear that if planes got too close, first thing they would do was shoot me. And the other thing I noticed was that these guys were very careful about avoiding villages. They didn't want, they were headed for a safe house, and they didn't want any contact with any civilians other than the people who ran the safe house. And stayed there for a day or two, and it went on like that, always moving from then on Route 1, mostly at night. And one of the things that I observed was, and at night, the roads were packed with people going in both directions. Of some vehicles, a lot of pedestrians, and there were checkpoints along the highway every so often. And there were often air raids at night. And everybody would pull off the road, and there might be flares dropped or whatever, or bombs, and things would keep on moving. Traffic moved quite a bit at night. And one thing that I observed, if I was walking along the highway, Vietnamese could tell that I was something different, and they would shine a flashlight on me. Just, it's dark, or semi-darkness, and just the way I walk, or my build, or something, they knew I wasn't Vietnamese, and they would immediately shine a flashlight on me to see what's going on. So, in a way, that's kind of like,
Sorry, sir.
in many ways, if you read the literature of escaped slaves from back in the 1800s, it's the same sort of thing. You're different than they are, and they know it right away. You can't hide. In fact, most of the escape attempts that failed, that's what happened. They were spotted, and immediately everybody knows what's going on. Anyway, and eventually on Sunday morning, the 29th of January, 1967, after driving all night in this truck with a couple of exhausted soldiers, in the truck with me were several North Vietnamese soldiers who had absolutely no interest in me. They were just tired, and they were going home on leave or something. And there were two guards who had been my guards for about a week, and there was wreckage from another guy shot down. There was a bloody flight suit and a pistol that they'd taken from his body, I guess. And
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second. I've got somebody caught my throat. I don't want to interrupt your story.
sure.
There you go.
Yeah, so on the morning of Sunday morning, the 29th, I'm taken, now I'm blindfolded in the truck, of course. So we get to the front of the prison, and guard comes out from the prison, dismisses the guards who have been charging me up to this time, and they take me inside the main gate, left turn, down a hallway, another left turn into a room. Doors slammed shut and locked. So I'm standing there in this room with my blindfold on, and I'm thinking to myself, well, maybe if I take the blindfold off, nobody will remember that it was on when I came in. So I can then look around. So I'm in this room, which many guys had their first interrogation there, called the Blue Room. And it's a room about 10 by 15, and at one end of it has a table, wooden table, with a nice chair behind it for the interrogator and a stool in front of it for those being interrogated. Okay, you look up and it's all concrete and masonry, and there's a big hook hanging from the overhead. In one corner there is a pile of bloody rags, and I know that this is going to be the beginning of bad times. And about 10 minutes later, they started.
And if you would sketch a brief chronology of your movements in the various camps and where you spent.
Yeah, okay. Well, of course, okay, I just told you my story of arriving in Hanoi. Then that section that I just described is what's called New Guy Village. And there are no real cells there, but there are a bunch of interrogation cells around that courtyard. Okay, stayed there for some time, and then later I was put in Hanoi in the Heartbreak Hotel, which is a special section that has solitary cells. I was there for, I don't know, several weeks, I guess. And eventually, I'm thinking sometime in March, I was moved to the main part of Little Vegas. And that's where I saw Jim Mulligan, had that experience. And about a month later, and I think it was in April, I was introduced to my first cellmate, Jay Jaro, Air Force guy, good guy. And various incidents happened there. And I stayed there until the summer of 1967, when Ralph Gaither and I were sent out to the power plant. And I was there until the middle of October 1967. Then it was back to Little Vegas, and I stayed there until I think it's going to be the fall of 1968, and then I was sent out to Sante. Now, I was not at Sante during the raid, nobody was. Anyway, and I spent a year in Sante, and then because I was Catholic, all the Catholics in that camp were taken back to the zoo annex, and a bunch of us were put in a cell there. And the idea was they were going to have a big Christmas religious thing, and those who wanted to go to church could go, and of course they would get the pictures and all that stuff. And so I declined to go to church, didn't ever go. Some people went. And I was in the zoo annex for a fair amount of time. And then after that, from the zoo annex, moved to Camp Faith, which was this was the beginning of better treatment for prisoners. They had built a large prisoner of war camp outside the city of Hanoi, which would be the only place that you would recognize from the movies you've watched as a POW camp. Had big high walls, barbed wire on top, watchtowers all around. But the living conditions there were actually quite a bit better, because there were a bunch of walled compounds, and within each walled compound there were several huts. And the good part about that was that during the day the huts could be opened and you could be out in the compound doing exercise or whatever he felt like doing. So it was a major step up in living conditions. Okay, what happened? Okay, that's 1970. And in the fall of 1970, the Sante raid took place. Unfortunately, Sante camp by that time was empty. All the Americans had been moved out of it to this new Camp Faith several months before the raid. So the raid took place on an empty camp, and as it happened, this Camp Faith was out of the city in the same direction as Sante, just not quite as far. So now you got to take this in context. Remember that in 1968, when the elections were coming for president, just before the elections, in order to perhaps help Humphrey, the Democratic candidate, Johnson had ended all bombing of North Vietnam. So now we're at 1970. It's been 2 years. No bombing, no new prisoners, no news. Because one of the sources of news were new prisoners. Okay, what's going on? All right, so no new prisoners, no news, been 2 years. Also, after 2 years of no bombing, no aircraft, nothing of that sort, now there's a big raid going on. There's shooting, there are missiles, all kinds of stuff is going on. We can hear the airplanes. We know something big has happened not far away. All right, the next day, we start hearing trucks. And so what has happened is the Vietnamese have emptied out the Hanoi Hilton of Vietnamese prisoners, which is, it's an ordinary jail for them and a big part of it. They brought those guys out, and we're loaded into the trucks back to the Hanoi Hilton. And for most of us, that's where we spent the rest of the war. I was in the Hanoi Hilton from then until the spring of 1972, when the war heated up again, and about 150 of us were moved to a camp up on the Chinese border, we being selected for whatever reason as their ace in the hole, the people who couldn't be rescued. Because if you look at where that dog patch, we called it, where that camp was located, in a little corner of Vietnam, which is almost in China. It's as far as you can go coming from the ocean, and very difficult to reach without advance warning if you're coming from Thailand, as the Air Force would. And the plan was for them to take us across the border into China if there was any trouble. And at night, while we're locked in our cells, we can hear the Vietnamese outside rehearsing this operation. So I was there from the spring of 1972 until January of 1973, when all of us were moved back down to the Hanoi Hilton in preparation for the end of the war, which by that time had been negotiated.
Wow.
Switching batteries, sir.
Yeah, actually, I'd like to give you a little break. You've been talking, we've gone for about an hour and a bit. And
Sure.
so just to give you, Alex, if you could, I'm gonna.
And you have water, sir, next to your chair.
Oh, yeah, thanks.